I want to veer away from technology and resistance and pesticides and talk about just why we need to focus on the natural qualities of our food. That is, I want to talk about why food is a biological result and why it can't be a technological result, and why that quality takes time. I want to explain why we are like tomatoes. You and I are just like tomatoes. The question is, do we want to be garden tomatoes, or do we want to be greenhouse tomatoes? I think most of you already get that reference, but let me explain it my way. To a gourmet, a garden-ripe tomato is the epitome of fresh food. I don't think there's another food out there that can elicit the same response from the first bite and the second bite and the third bite. The eater's response is almost rhapsodic. You know, no one can take a bite of a garden fresh tomato and not comment on the flavors. Those tomatoes make common foods better. They make common foods special. And almost as rewarding as eating a tomato is watching other people eat one and then just smiling at the expressions on their faces when they do the same thing. So what just happened here? Let's explore what a tomato is and what it represents as sort of an analogy to food in general. A tomato plant is a small ecosystem. That's part of a larger ecosystem. It reaches into the soil and it reaches into the air, and it interacts with both the living and the non-living species and components and aspects of the external environment. And the biochemistry of the tomato, the plant, is a function of those interactions. So the internal ecosystem of the plant works with the external ecosystem surrounding it to sort of collaboratively produce this penultimate physical expression, this juicy red seed-filled tomato. The tomato fruit is a result of this plant ecosystem interacting with the ecosystem around it, and the fruit is sort of the intersection of those two ecosystems meeting. And one of those ecosystems is nested within the other one, and I want to emphasize the nestedness aspect. It shouldn't be underestimated because it's a key element that seems to have been lost in this race toward technological improvements in agriculture. The fact that the tomato is an ecosystem that's nested inside another ecosystem that it depends on. The plant begins life as a seed in the soil and responding to different environmental cues, mostly temperature and water. But those two stimulate the dormant embryo to begin rapid cell division and expansion and growth. And as the seedling grows, the roots extend to the soil and they begin to interact with bacteria and fungi and nematodes and large numbers of microbes and invertebrates. Many of those interactions are negative, but many of them are beneficial. Importantly, the positive interactions are necessary for growth. But in many ways, the negative interactions are also necessary for the growth and health of the plant. And that's a very important concept, is that the negative interactions may not be as important as the positive ones, but they are important. Some, like fungal interactions that interact with the roots, like these mycorrhizal fungi. That's a little pine tree, by the way. The little pine tree roots go, you see sort of a circular area at sort of where the roots start extending? That's where the roots are. There are no roots beyond that point on a pine tree. All the rest of that is fungi, ectomycorrhizal fungi that are attached to the roots. And without those fungi attached to the roots, that plant will get about a foot and a half tall, and then it will die. So in sterile soil, pine trees of any species cannot live. They must have mycorrhizal fungi. They provide this plant with all of the things that its roots can't do, and that is nutrients and water primarily. And the fungi get some carbon in return from the plant, but they are an absolutely necessary component of the soil for growth of any conifer, regardless of where it lives. And importantly, as the plant matures and produces flowers that are pollinated by bees and flies and butterflies, the number of pollinations determines the number of seeds that are produced. A large number of organisms roam the surfaces of the plants. Some of those are attempting to eat the leaves and the fruit, the flowers. Others are in search of those organisms to prey on them. The tomato plant not only represents a very large number of interactions with the environment, but it also acts as the context for a great many other interactions. And some of those interactions are an invariable part of the life of the plant. But others are chance encounters, they're serendipitous. They may or may not occur in the life of an individual plant. But all in all, the plant is favored by those interactions, and it endures those interactions. Now, how well the tomato plant, achieves its reproductive potential depends on the quality and the quantity of those interactions between the internal ecosystem and the external ecosystem. Some tomato plants will be more susceptible to the depredations of herbivores. They're attempting to maximize their own reproductive potential. Other plants will be able to resist, and they may be able to defend themselves from predators. Some plants will respond better by growing and interacting with below-ground microbial community. And when they do that, they'll have better access to nutrients. But overall, the negative and beneficial outcomes of these interactions depend largely on the genetic makeup of the plant. So in biology, the genetic makeup of the individual organism is the genotype. And that's the DNA that codes for every trait in each individual. Every gene in an individual is contained in the DNA found in every cell, but not all genes are expressed. So, for example, every cell in my finger contains my entire genome. Every single chromosome with every single gene in every single cell in my finger. Yet my finger, not particularly active. It doesn't use all of that information. It's not needed to be a finger. The task of being a finger cell is really not that complex. Not as much as some other cells in the body. But all of the genes are present, even if they're never used. A lot of those genes are, even in the finger cells, are initially turned off, but may later be turned on. So it's important that they're present. So an example would be the growth of body hair after puberty. Not there. Later on, after some sort of threshold has been crossed, they are there. Some cells are turned on initially and then later turned off. So before we were born, we all expressed fetal hemoglobin, but after we were born, we expressed adult hemoglobin. And then there's a whole bunch of genes in there that are not particularly useful. They're recessive genetics diseases and are best left unused entirely. But they're all there in every single cell. Every cell possesses the entire genetic potential of the individual, but very little of that potential is expressed at any one time. Now, the expression is what we need to get to here. The expression of the genotype, what we actually see in an individual, is called the phenotype. The phenotype can be thought of as the expression of the genotype in a particular environment. In other words, the environment stimulates the genotype to be expressed in different ways and under different conditions. So, for example, in the summer, an Arctic hare is brown, but in the winter, it's white. And that pattern switches back and forth each year. So genes are being turned off, and genes are being turned on, and then they're being turned off, and back and forth over and over. This, by the way, is the emerging study of epigenetics, things that can be turned on and off, not as a result of our growth and maturity, but maybe as a result of our interaction with the environment around us. If the environment doesn't provide the right cues, the genotype doesn't express a particular phenotype. So, for example, the hydrangea, everybody knows hydrangea is a popular plant, makes very large, pretty heads of flowers. They can range in color from pink to deep purple. The particular color depends on the acidity of the soil, and the more acidic soil causes plants to produce flowers at the blue end of the spectrum. What's important is that the potential for the range of flower colors is always there, but the environment determines what flower color is going to be expressed on a particular plant. The garden tomato is just such an expression of the genotype interacting with the environment. A fully ripened, fresh-picked tomato grown in an outdoor garden is an amazing taste sensation. It's a literal explosion of a multitude of flavors. In contrast, a tomato grown in a greenhouse environment is an insipid pretender. It can have a granular texture, poor color, very little taste, very little complexity. The two fruits are sometimes so unalike as to be unrelated. It's like comparing a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. Are they the same animal? They can share exactly, in the tomato situation, they can share exactly the same genotype. The exact same genotype, but clearly not have the same phenotype. How is this possible? We have to understand the purpose of the tomato fruit and its role in the evolutionary history of the tomato plant. A plant is a long record. It's a record of this evolutionary battle with its environment. For almost as long as there have been flowering plants, there have been any number of insects that have attempted to eat the roots, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, the fruits, the seeds, you name it, on the plant. Plants have very little recourse but to defend themselves against a hungry world. Plants, in fact, are the bottom of the food chain. They cannot run away. They have to defend themselves where they grow. To do this, they can defend themselves with physical protections in the form of spines and bristles and hairs and any number of other things, structure as well, like in the cactuses. Or they can defend themselves with chemicals that are toxic in one way or another. To some extent, every plant possesses chemical defenses. Every plant. As these defenses have evolved to ward off the insect world, particularly the insect world, but there are a number of other organisms out there that certainly eat plants, but we'll use insects as our example. They've had to develop these compounds, but the problem with biological systems is the biological systems can also adapt in return. The insects are forced to adapt to overcome the plant's defensive compounds. The plant then, of course, as these insects became less susceptible to their toxins, had to then adapt to produce either better defenses or more defenses in response. And this back and forth process, well, there you go. That's what we call the Red Queen hypothesis. For every adaptation, there's a counter-adaptation. For every counter-adaptation, there's a counter-adaptation, and on and on. And this, the Red Queen hypothesis has been borrowed by a number of different branches of biology, notably pathogens and hosts is a good example, but we've also used it in ecology. The catch here is that there is no adaptation that allows one of the organisms to win the race. There isn't a winning of this race. This is a race that you run, but it's a race that can't be won. There is no finish line. The problem is if you don't run, you lose. There is losing. There's just never winning. Winning means not losing. That's what winning means in this world. And so that's why this is such a great literary analogy for what's going on in biology. The evolutionary arms race, as it's been called, is a battle between organisms in which one is typically trying to eat the other, and the other is, of course, defending itself. And under natural conditions, no one ever holds the upper hand for very long. If they did, the other species would likely go extinct. Every living species of plant, for its entire history, has successfully fended off the challenges from the external environment. And most of the time, this was through chemical defenses. As with all plants, the tomato is biochemically very complex. All plants produce an array of chemical compounds, that are necessary for the day-to-day functions of the plant. These, by the way, these are called primary compounds. Under normal circumstances, these are the compounds that the plant requires for just growth and health. So amino acids, DNA, chlorophyll, proteins, you name it, all of those are those biochemical constructs that help the plant be a plant. Those are primary compounds. Everything else in the plant is what we call a secondary compound or a secondary metabolite. they have been derived from primary compounds in one way or another, like phenols and terpenes and alkaloids. These are all the poisons and toxins, but usually poisons and toxins. Other things. They originated from mutations to the genes for the primary compounds, and those mutations resulted in somewhat modified chemicals that had perhaps new functions. And if the new function assisted the plant in defending itself in any way from herbivores, and that led to increased production of seeds, then that mutation would have been positive and would have been a very important part of the genotype. In plants, we often see dozens to hundreds of these things. And we assume that their presence in the plant is evidence of a long and successful history of defense against animals. That's why they're there. These are adaptations, so they must represent something. These compounds can be found in every part of the plant, from the root tip to the shoot tip, and especially in the fruits and seeds. In the tomato plant, there are over 400 different volatile chemical compounds. 400 just in the tomato plant. All of them are secondary compounds, and at least 30 of those are important contributors to flavor. At least 30. The flavor of the tomato is a delicate balance of these compounds in combination with some pretty basic ones, such as sugar, sweetness, and sour, and bitter, and those. Why are these so-called defense compounds involved in flavor, particularly in what we would consider good flavor? Well, herbivores attack the tomato at every stage in life. Let's see. Yeah. Self from attacks on, I can hear myself now. Every part of the plant at every growth stage. To complete its life cycle, the plant has to protect each of these different parts. The leaves are needed to produce sugars to grow the plant, so they're vital. They have to be protected. The roots are needed to absorb water and nutrients from the soil, so they're vital, and they have to be protected. Eventually, the plant has to produce flowers and seeds and fruits to ensure the genetic continuity of the plant and the family line into the next generation, and those structures have to be defended vigorously. The defense of leaves and roots and stems helps the plant produce enough energy to complete this cycle, and so the defense of every part of the plant is critical. However, the plant is also faced with attracting friends while repelling enemies, and thus different parts of the plant are defended to different degrees. Flowers are chemically defended differently than our seeds. Flowers, are the window dressing. They're the advertisement to attract pollinators. So in most cases, the plant really doesn't want to attract lots of insects, but in the case of pollination, it's important to put signs out that say, this store is now open, and there's free food inside. But they're only necessary to attract the pollinators, and once the pollination has been achieved, the colorful flower parts typically fade or fall away. And then they cease to be a visual attraction, and they have a very different value than seeds. The seeds are the offspring of the plant, and so they have to be defended in very different ways. After pollination, and when seeds are developing, they're not colorful, they're not obvious. They're hidden and obscured from view. At that point, the young fruit is the young fruit just after pollination and the flower has started to fade. It's a fascinating biochemical combination of both defense and non-defense compounds, depending on the stage it's in. Eventually, the plant uses fruit to attract fruit eaters, but this is only true when the fruit is brightly colored, and not when it's green. Until the fruit is ripe, it's physically or chemically defended because the seeds contained inside are still developing and they're highly vulnerable. During this stage, the fruit is not obvious. It blends in. But after the seeds mature, the fruit ripens, and the change to a bright color that contrasts with the green is an indicator to fruit eaters that the fruit is now available. It's ready for eating, and it's undefended. And it's a It's a literal advertisement for food. At that point, animals can consume this sweet, tasty, nutritious, and non-toxic fruit that contains the mature seeds, and the fruit typically passes very quickly through the animals and before the seeds can be digested. And it's no accident that fruit has a great deal of fiber in it. It enhances the rapid passage through digestive systems. So the stages of development in the tomato plant require a wide range of different chemical compounds for ensuring this completion of this reproductive process. And that leads to the ultimate goal of dispersing tomato seeds. The abundance of these compounds goes up and down inside the plant, but the numbers of different compounds is really surprisingly very high. Here's the point of my story. The taste of that tomato, what we find so attractive is a combination of the chemicals that are among the very last to develop in the fruit. They aren't there when the fruit is picked green or pink or slightly red. They're there when it is fully red. It's not until it's fully ripened that the full complement of the flavors are present. The vitamins, the proteins, amino acids, the sugars, these are all substances that are nutritious, but they're only present in certain amounts. The volatile compounds contribute to flavor, and they also add other complements to the basic nutrition. They're often residual defensive compounds from earlier stages that have been broken down, partly broken down, or being reused in other ways. All of these chemicals come together to give the tomato its characteristic flavor and its characteristic qualities. And all of them are the result of the interaction between the tomato plant and the environment, both in the past and in the present. Today we grow the vast majority of tomatoes that we eat in greenhouses and other controlled environments. Literally all of the tomatoes sold in conventional grocery stores, including most organic tomatoes, are rarely grown outside in nature. They are grown in very small amounts of relatively sterile soil, and often with no soil at all, and with a steady supply of artificial fertilizers. In other words, they're grown by recipe. Every tomato plant is now pushed to produce enormous quantities of fruit under non-natural conditions and with no interaction with the environment. And yes, I understand there's a need to produce large quantities of food. Yeah, for 327 million hungry Americans. But when we taste a greenhouse tomato, we should not wonder at its lack of tomato flavor. Instead, we should ask a much more important and relevant question. If the phenotype of the plant is the interaction between the genotype and the environment, then how is it possible to achieve the phenotype if the genotype never has an opportunity to interact with the environment? In simpler terms, how can a tomato grow up properly if it never goes outside? To get a tasty tomato, the tomato plant has to go outside. It has to interact with the environment to which it is adapted so that its genotype can be fully expressed. The tomato plant, like many plants, doesn't have to produce defensive compounds. Those defensive compounds that become part of the flavor of the plant, it does not have to produce them. Many plants don't use the energy necessary for defense unless they have been attacked. So the plants defend themselves only after detecting physical damage from an herbivore. When we grow tomato plants that never experience the stress of being eaten or attacked, they may not be induced to produce the compounds that create the best tasting fruit or those that have the most health benefits. So by analogy, a human individual can have the genetic potential for being a very fast runner, but unless she forces her bones and muscles to become stronger by the stress of exercise, she'll never achieve that physical potential. Greenhouse tomatoes will never be as good as garden tomatoes because their true character can only be expressed under slightly stressful conditions, somewhat similar to those that cause the plant to evolve and maintain the genotype that it has in the first place. The tomatoes we buy today have lived their entire lives in a stress-free environment. The natural environment is a multi-species, multi-stress period of time in which the plants adjust to and accommodate the stress while fulfilling their evolutionary goal of reproducing into the next generation, of being successful at that. When you eat a wonderfully tasty garden tomato, you're experiencing the full expression of the plant's genetic potential with all its vitamins and protein and antioxidant benefits. When you eat a greenhouse tomato, you're being cheated. The benefits are not the same. They can't be the same. The same principle applies to all organisms. Unless the genetic, biochemical, and multi-species internal ecosystem of any organism is exposed to the multi-factor, multi-species external ecosystem in which it normally resides, the tomato of that organism can't be produced. So yes, the full expression of the individual is a function of many species, because each of us contains a world of minute organisms inside our bodies. We contain an internal ecosystem that can and must interact with the outside world if we're going to remain healthy. All individual plants are ecosystems. All the animals that eat those plants are ecosystems, and they interact with those plants. And all the communities of plants and animals are ecosystems that interact with other ecosystems. They're nested within those ecosystems. The ecosystem of the individual is adapted to the larger ecosystem, and in ways that we can't count. And the full potential of the individual is expressed when its healthy internal ecosystem is interacting with the surrounding external ecosystem, which, by the way, must also be healthy. Organisms that are adapted to certain environments best express their abilities in that environment. Their internal ecosystems are healthiest when they're embedded in the external ecosystem to which they are adapted. When they grow in a different environment, whether it's more stressful or less stressful, the genetic potential of the organism cannot be realized. In addition, if the natural environment is lacking important factors, or it's been simplified and lacks natural complexity, this is going to change the relationship between the internal and external worlds. The concept applies to humans completely. Our ability to thrive can be either enhanced or compromised by the quality of the external environment, because it interacts with and it determines the quality of our internal environment. At no point in our lives are we separate from our environment. And in fact, nothing could be more dangerous to our well-being. Even before birth, whatever our mothers ate or drank or consumed affected our nutrition and our biochemical balance. Were this not true, pregnant mothers would not be discouraged from limiting their intake of caffeine or alcohol or a large number of medications, nor would prenatal health checkups be necessary, but they are. Infant mortality rates dramatically decline when pregnant women are more aware of how the outside world affects their inside world. So humans are a product of our ecosystems, plural. We not only can't exist without our surrounding ecosystem, we wouldn't be here without it. The interaction between our internal ecosystem and the external ecosystem is more than just the exchange of food before and after it's eaten. The bacteria in our gut are colonized and recolonized from the outside, but the human body has far more interaction with the world than that. We have at least 5 senses, and we take information from the outside and interpret it on the inside. We breathe in the air, we drink in the water, we react to allergens. We provide a haven for bacteria and pathogens and parasites and any number of other things. We're home to more bacterial cells than human cells. And when the environment surrounding us doesn't help us maintain a healthy internal ecosystem, our personal health suffers. We are simplifying and damaging our external ecosystem in so many different ways. The long-term effects of this simplified external ecosystem on our internal ecosystem health is just beginning to be recognized, and the implications are not good ones. I've used a plant, this tomato, those tomatoes, yeah, as an example of the importance of the external environment to the physical and biochemical expression of the potential of the internal environment. What I mean, though, is that the quality of the food we eat is more than just the calories. It's the kind of calories. It's the context of the calories. It's the quality of those calories. For us to express our potential as humans, for us to be of the highest quality possible, our food must also be of high quality. We are and we have been on this path of lowering quality and emphasizing quantity by reducing the biological process of food production and turning it into a technological process. And if what we eat is produced as if it is no more than a recipe for making calories, then we are essentially saying that our evolutionary history and that of our food has no bearing on our health. We're saying that the 30 trillion bacteria in our gut that are apparently integral to our health and development can survive on bleached, vitamin-enriched, gluten-enhanced, genetically manipulated wheat. We're saying that even though we have next to no understanding of how our microbiome contributes to our health and how that contribution is influenced by the food we eat, we can continue to simplify both our food and the ecosystem around us without any consequences. If that's what we're saying, then we're missing a fact that stares us directly in the face. We are not only what we eat, we also are not what we do not eat. If we don't eat quality, then how can we expect to be quality? In closing my rant, I would like to say that we simplify and modify our world and our food at our peril. All tomatoes are not created equal. To understand a tomato, we have to understand the evolutionary history of that tomato. We have to understand what it means to be a tomato and what it means to be a tomato of quality, and I encourage everyone here to try to be a tomato of quality. This is the direction I'm going, and the book I'm working on now is more taking a look at the importance of how we are nested. We are a nested ecosystem inside a much larger ecosystem, and each of us is a little ecosystem walking around on two legs, but each of us demands and requires that the surrounding ecosystem be of high quality, otherwise we cannot be of high quality either. And we're seeing the consequences of this in the health of our culture, not just our individual health, but the health of our culture and the health of our species. The ramifications of simplifying our food supply that we've seen over the past couple of decades, and in innumerable ways when it comes to individual health, we have to start thinking about what this means for our health as a population and what it means for our health as a species, because we're doing this to the entire world. And we're exporting our technology to other countries and encouraging them to use that technology as well. We have to understand that this is a pathway that is not sustainable, and I don't mean that in the way that we use sustainability in farming. I mean that it's not sustainable in the long run for the health of us as a species. So we've heard a lot about that earlier today and also last night when it comes to chemicals, genetically modified crops, the industrial processes we use to produce food. All of those things are linked. We need to take a step back and ask ourselves, not necessarily, we should ask what it means for us as individuals, but not necessarily what it means for us as individuals, but what this pattern, this program of food production means in the longer term scope of things. And what I'm going to suggest is that we must pay attention to the broader scope, what it means to all of us, and then ask ourselves the very hard question as a society whether or not this is highly immoral, what we are doing to food and what that action does to us. So I want to thank you for your patience and your very generous attention, and I would be happy if we have time to take any questions that you might have. Yes, ma'am.
First, when you said organic, I have tomatoes. I have a bunch of friends that are willing to spend a lot more money for heirloom tomatoes. And I'm like, is that just a title? Or is it just, is it worth the extra money because it's an heirloom and still has the green leaves attached to it? But that's the second section of that is, you're talking about the greenhouse. My husband, who's a wonderful gardener, but he wants a greenhouse for Hanukkah so he can grow more stuff, and he also wants to sprout a whole bunch of stuff in the basement. So the way I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying is it might not be worth it for him to get the greenhouse for Hanukkah and sprout stuff in the basement. Oh, that's what I'm trying to learn about.
Anytime someone's growing their own food, I'm 100% in favor of that, 100%. And I don't want to imply that a greenhouse-grown tomato does not have any quality, but let's be clear that it cannot have the same quality, right? There are going to be some components missing. Are they important components? I don't know. It's really hard to say. Taste is an important component to me, and they quite often don't have that. Your question about heirloom tomatoes and organic tomatoes in the grocery store chains are very aware of how much people will pay for organic and heirloom, and they are more than willing to find people to grow those products. You'll notice that the heirloom tomatoes, you can usually tell them because they have green tops and they're wrinkled and they quite often are scarred. But they're so perfect these days, you have to wonder, how in the world did you manage to grow an heirloom tomato with no scars on it? There weren't any organisms around attempting to eat them, is the main reason. They probably do have better flavor. They probably do. But anytime money can be made, you know that there's going to be an attempt for someone to try to provide that to buyers. If that's what buyers want, they will find it for them. Organic tomatoes cannot be grown in hydroponic systems because they can't get certified in hydroponic systems, but they can be grown in hothouses and greenhouses. So many of the organic tomatoes, again, this is what others have said before me up here, is that, and Stephen alluded to this also, find out who your growers are, find out who your suppliers are, find out who you trust, and work with them. If we want to stimulate an economy that produces higher quality food, then we have to go find those people and work with them. Otherwise, I think that we're leaving our food supply to more commercial interests, and we know pretty well, I think, what direction that will go. Don't give up on the greenhouse, absolutely. Grow your own food. If there are no more questions, all right, thank you for your time.